Hello and welcome to my channel on the best of. Oh, wait, no, it's my channel.
It's your channel.
Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. Hello, Philip.
Hello, Dr. Canavan. How are you today?
I am doing very well. My friend, my nemesis,
Good.
my
This
freminist.
Nemesis.
And today, my friend, Dr. Chase, we are going to be discussing, as a continuation of, talking about these concepts and foundational aspects of how we understand literature. Today, we're going to be discussing symbolism. Symb-
Symbols. I like it. I wore one for you just to help you out.
you're so kind. Like in the last video where you explained to me how locale is spelled.
Hey, I just got to make sure, I'm always thinking of you. So.
So we want to talk about symbolism because quite often when we read, we talk about the surface level, the literal level, what the words physically are representing on the page, and what is actually happening. But when we think about communication, there are levels of communication because we can talk about the surface level, we can talk about subtext, we can talk about implication, and we can talk about abstract nature of things. And symbolism ties very much into this abstract of taking something that happens and making it representative or
Right.
linked to something else, would be a very broad, generalized way of looking at this. So why don't you start us off? Symbols and symbolism. What do you want to
Sure.
say just initially?
Yeah, let's start by defining, I guess, our terms. So a symbol is something that represents something else in the simplest of terms. Now, you could think of one of those yellow smiley faces as a symbol of happiness, for example, right? Or the skull and the crossbones, being a symbol of danger or poison or something of that nature, right? We have
Pirates.
yeah, our pirates, if you like. We have agreed on certain associations with these images, let's say. In literature, a symbol, I think it's fair to say, often functions on a slightly more complex level. It's not a direct association as the symbols we've just been talking about. In fact, oftentimes an author will try to be a bit coy when it comes to the meaning behind a symbol. They won't say this means that, right? So the Raven in Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven, is not just, a direct equivalent of some. You can't just say it just means this, right? So in other words, in literature, symbols tend to be richly suggestive, and there may be multiple plausible associations, connotations, meanings that you can explore. And they are meant to be that way, that they're left a bit open in that sense. And that is one important thing to know about symbols in literature. So that is, I think, one of the biggest things that I want to emphasize today is that when handled often when handled well, a symbol is just richly suggestive of multiple possible things. So maybe we should throw out an example that might be familiar to a lot of
Oh,
people. Yeah,
before we get into the examples, so something I wanted to sort of build on what you said there is
sure.
not always a one-to-one correlation.
Right.
And we look at a traffic symbol, the red hazard symbol, and you go, right, that means hazard. And it is a one-to-one and only a one-to-one.
Right.
But when we move into literature and the use of symbols as abstract concepts, as you pointed out, there's this space built into them, a flexibility built into the interpretation, that a range of interpretations will now be will now fit, and some will fit closer and more neatly, some will kind of fit, some will barely fit, but they can
Mm.
all be part of that range. And then there'll be some that would be wildly left turn at the traffic lights there. Where are you getting this from? Symbols aren't infinitely flexible.
No.
There tends to be guidance within a text to suggest how it fits. And yeah, our own personal interpretation is always going to guide us in how we understand that, how we understand how it fits. But it will be within a range of conceptual meanings and conceptual understandings that will fit with the other parts of the narrative. So I just wanted to build on what you had said there, because I thought that was a really excellent point, and it sort of it bore repeating a little bit and a wee bit more clarification.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's really the main thing that I always stress when I talk about symbols with my students in terms of literature. But there are a lot of great examples that some might be familiar to people. I don't want to spoil stories for anyone, but there's one story that most people probably, at least in the United States, have read, and it's called The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. I suspect that most people were made to read that in high school, perhaps in college. But it's a great story in terms of symbolism, because at the heart of this story is this ritual, the lottery. And if you've read the story, you'll know what I'm talking about. The story is set in what seems like, kind of 1940s America, rural kind of, apple pie, baseball kind of Americana.
Slightly bucolic.
Yes, bucolic, that sort of thing. But there is this gathering of people in the beginning of the story, and the readers kind of, oh, there's some little thing they always do on this day, and um, I guess it's okay to spoil this story. It's 60, 70 years old, 80, maybe even 80 something years old. So if you haven't read it, I'm about to spoil what happens, but it's uh-oh. So in the course of this, you start to realize there are some of these very dark undertones in the conversation, that the people are slightly awkward, that they're trying a little too hard to pretend that what they're doing is normal. And then they start doing this lottery thing, and everybody has to draw a piece of paper from this box, this old box that's painted black, and it's all chipped and worn and everything. And everybody gets this piece of paper, and then one family, it's done, by the way, by the head of the family, the patriarch, the male, the father of the family. Each family draws a piece of paper. Most of them are blank. All of them are blank except for one, which has a dot drawn on it. And the father with the dot on his piece of paper, then there's a second phase where his family members all have to draw a piece of paper from the box. And the one who draws the dot again is the winner of the lottery. Yay!
And what do they win, Philip?
They win. They get to get stoned.
Death by stoning.
Death by stoning. And all the villagers then say, okay, sorry, Tessie. Because Tessie's the one who draws it. And then, boom, they start throwing stones at her. And that's kind of where it ends, really. Isn't she saying, no, it's not fair. We should do it again. Whereas she was going along with it the whole time until it was her family. And then suddenly it was, oh, we didn't do it right. So the box is a symbol in the story. The whole ritual of the lottery is a symbol in the story. There are several possible ways of interpreting these symbols. The box is like as simple as that. It's painted black. Why is it painted black? Well, when in our culture, we often have associations with death when we think of the color black. It's darkness. It's a lack of light. It's a lack of life. But you could also argue that the box, having been used for generations, and they've forgotten really a lot of the ritual is been simplified over the years. But it's so the box itself is all chipped and worn. So you could argue that the box represents tradition, right? That it is a kind of this is something that's been passed down, and they don't even understand why it started or what they're doing, but they just keep doing it because, by golly, that's what we did last year, right? So you could argue that it means that, right? I mean, so both meanings are plausible within the context of the story, and are supported by elements of the story.
And the black dot on the piece of paper.
Yeah.
And it's, again, so the idea, the piece of paper, it's pure, it's clean. And then the one that has been marked. We could talk about Treasure Island and the whole superstition about the black dot marking you for death, which
Right.
as soon as you see it come up in the lottery, you're like, oh, Treasure Island, which is a nice little allusion to that. And it's playing on the same concept of this being a market and singling someone out. And then we can think about how, what is these symbols, and how we're looking at this, and how the character Tessie, she was fine with it when it could have been someone else.
Right.
But then as soon as it lands on her, there's this reaction, this isn't fair, because now she is doing it. So we can see how this ties into understanding it as traditions that we are happy to perpetuate, even if they are barbaric and unjust or destructive. We are happy to perpetuate these as long as we aren't the ones who have to pay the price. But as soon as it's us, you go, hang on a sec, we need to change that. And so we see how the use of these symbols ties into the narrative, what the narrative is exploring in Jack's excellent short story.
Mm.
And so it's not only the sinister nature of it, how something that looks like the whole story starts with this wonderful, like everyone's gathering and everyone's having fun, and the boys are running around picking up stones and making little piles. And we think that this is some sort of festival. And in effect, it is a kind of festival. This is an annual tradition. And you could make links to The Wicker Man, which would be another version very much of the same story. But it is absolutely fascinating how, when you think of these things representing tradition, instead of it just being a box and instead of just being a lottery, when we think of it in that more abstract notion of the box, yes, being a box that contains all these things, but also meaning tradition, how we then think of tradition and how traditions are perpetuated. And even though they're not exactly the same, or even if we don't fully understand why they started, we just keep them going and we adapt them to the modern day. We make little changes. So this is not the original box. The tickets that they use are not the original way they did it. They used to do it with wooden chips. That we see how they have constantly updated this tradition, but kept the essence of the tradition going.
Right.
And reading the box and this lottery as a commentary on the devastating power of tradition to excuse awful behavior because, well, this is what we have always done. It leads us to think of different meanings and layers to this story and what it is communicating. And that's why symbolism, when we start thinking about symbols, we don't go, this symbol, for instance, red rose. Red rose very frequently is symbolic of romantic love.
Yep.
But if a red rose appears in a story, we don't go, well, that just means romantic love. We look at the context of the story to guide our interpretation of what the rose might symbolize.
Yeah.
And that is both the beauty of symbols, but also the complexity, the difficulty of them, because it's not a one-to-one, it is not a direct translation, and it's that kind of slippery, abstract nature of things that gives us as readers room to interpret, but also can feel a little bit you're at sea because you don't have the guardrails of specific guidance.
Precisely. And I think there's some great examples in fantasy. Fantasy is a genre that is conducive to symbolism in many ways, and in a very rich ways. Some of my favorite authors really enjoy using symbols. Ursula Le Guin, for example, or I think use one that I don't think we have to worry about spoiling. How about the ring in Lord of the Rings? We could talk about that.
That can have symbolic meaning.
Now, this is a great example because Tolkien was himself very resistant to the idea that some people's interpretations of the ring in an allegorical sense, where it tended to be, and this is a great rich one. We have a good discussion on this one, I think, because Tolkien did not like the idea of his story being allegorical, which allegory tends to have a more one-for-one association. And that was his problem when people would say, oh, the ring represents nuclear weapons, or something like that. And he'd be, No, I think the way Tolkien understood the ring for him, and he would agree that I'm sure he would have agreed it was a symbol, but that it was in the sense that we were talking about earlier, in a more rich, that like, you can't just say one thing and this is it, right? But nevertheless, there are a lot of things we can say about the ring in Lord of the Rings. So yeah, what were you going to say about it?
Well, what I was going to say about it was that the whole thing, Tolkien didn't like allegory. Tolkien
Right.
didn't like allegory being um, applied as the only way to that one to one, this X means Y. That Tolkien resisted that because, as a professor of literature, as a professor of Anglo-Saxon, he is well aware of this. That yeah, there are a range of meanings associated with it. Stop saying it is only one thing. Like
Right.
we just spoke about how the box, because of its black coloring, that that is tied to darkness and evocations of sinisterness. And but that only becomes apparent as the lottery goes on and we realize what is happening. Up until then, we didn't have that reading of why that color was chosen. It could have been any color. In fact, Jackson could have had the box red, and you go, oh, because it's about a blood sacrifice. We would have read that meaning into it. If it was
Right.
yellow, you'd go, okay, the box is yellow. It's hard. You can see how changing that color, it doesn't fit with the rest as easily.
Right.
But so not everything has to have symbolic meaning or resonance.
Right.
But when it does very neatly fall into a pattern, you go, right, that's interesting. So saying the ring means nuclear weapons, you go, that is too narrow a distinction. But
Right.
if we potentially said the ring as this symbol of power that people want and can abuse and can twist people's mind, much like nuclear weapons, we can read
Right.
the desire for the ring and the danger of the ring being like the desire and danger of nuclear weapons. You're still making that connection, but you're now no longer stating ring equals nuclear weapons.
Right.
We are reading it as part of the symbolic reading, as part of the symbolic meaning of seeing that range of possibilities. And therefore, nuclear weapons would be an expression of a broader, more abstract concept of the danger of power, the corruption of power, the lure of power.
Right.
And
Exactly.
for the YouTube auto sort of generating thing, power, because it,
It does not account for a Northern Irish accent very well, does it?
so like what would you say about that, about the ring in particular, because it's a fascinating and quite malleable symbol in a lot of respects.
It's one of the reasons why Lord of the Rings is, I think, in my mind, a great work of literature, because that of that openness. And I think you said it very well, that it does represent the allure of power, and the idea that this is something that affects every character except Tom Bombadil, I guess. We won't get into that. Uh, but that the potential is even more vast and scary when you have characters who are already like Gandalf or Galadriel, who are already powerful in and of themselves, which is one of the reasons why it's a hobbit that seems like the appropriate vessel to bring this thing to hopefully its destruction, right? That it's Frodo who's entrusted with the ring, because, well, maybe if he gives into the temptation, it's not as big a catastrophe as, say, Gandalf giving into the temptation. So the idea of the stakes at play are something that I think that the ring beautifully illustrates, and the idea of our our conflicted nature. We all have temptation. We all have darkness and light. We are no one of us is pure good or pure evil. That we are a
Well, apart
composition.
from you, you're pure evil.
Only in some alternate universe, maybe. I don't know. Um, Yeah, no, I think it's a rich symbol in that sense because it is in itself a symbol of power. It is a symbol of the allure of power. It is a symbol of the effects of power. And it is a symbol of our own inner natures, that we are creatures who are conflicted. We have good in us. We want to help others. We want to leave the world a better place. And then we also have greed and desire. And when we get into positions of power, I was a department chair for a little while, I was like, wow, I'm in charge now, the temptation to get a fat head when you're in a position of power is considerable. And that's why you often see people who seem like nice chaps before getting into positions of power, suddenly we see them in a different light. Something else comes out of them, that it's just like, wow, how did that person change? Is it something that it was there all along, or was the power something that brought that out in the individual? And you can see how the ring does that with characters, and even characters who don't even wear it, characters who are near it, like Boromir, for example. He has that tendency to want to save the day. He's an essentially good person, right? But when he gets to a certain point of temptation, he justifies an act of essentially evil by saying, no, I can do good with this thing. If I had this, I could. And so you can see it working on his mind that way. So it's an incredibly rich symbol.
And you even brought in there at the end the reading of the ring as evil, as a like straight, not a one-to-one correlation, but that being an additional meaning, not just power, but evil. That
Yeah.
all, and then it makes us think about the fact that all power has the potential to corrupt, or is all power always corrupting? And the old saw, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Right.
A lot of times symbols help us see aspects that are being investigated, not necessarily providing definitive answers, but being suggestive of these concepts, evoking aspects of theme, which we will talk about in another video. But
Yes.
evoking those things, and then when we read all of this stuff together, this is giving us multiple readings, multiple ways of feeling and interpreting the text. And because of that, the text feels deeper and richer and more meaningful. And depending on where we are in our lives and what we've experienced, it can create resonances that are stronger or weaker, depending on those things, but with the different levels. And so some of us reading The Lord of the Rings, we see it as, we might feel that the ring as power that can corrupt, that is the thing that is driving us. And then we think of an analogy or an aspect of our understanding of the world, which is why people went with the nuclear weapon thing, to think about when people were talking about this.
Right.
The nuclear arms race and nuclear testing, this was in the news. People were frightened about this absolute devastating power. That's why that connection rings so strongly. But for many of us now who
Very nice AP. Yeah.
didn't grow up in that time period, didn't grow up with the drills about duck and cover and all of this,
Yeah.
the nuclear weapon analogy and meaning and concept doesn't feel as strong. We can see it almost intellectually, or we can understand it from that perspective. But we might think about it more as different military weapons that have been developed, or political power, how it is representative of Sauron's desire to rule and control. And that is what the ring represents. Sauron wants an ordered, structured world with him at the front of it. And many of us who have, studied World War II go, well, that seems like a very familiar philosophy that we have heard before.
Mm.
And we can read it in those senses. But no one of those readings is the reading. But we can see that there are all of these linkages, some stronger, some weaker. And it's how we are understanding the broader concepts and how it fits with the story. And that's what's so fascinating about this, because we can talk about, okay, a crown. A crown is symbolic of the monarch, but a crown can also be symbolic of a ruler in general. The crown can be symbolic of rulership.
Mm-hmm.
The crown can be symbolic of nobility. That all of these things can be tied into the crown. How the symbol is deployed, what it is connected to, those are the things that guide our reading. And we don't just point it and go, a crown means this. We look at it in conjunction with the narrative in which it is situated.
Precisely. And something that you mentioned, I think you said it very well, but I just want to emphasize it once again because it's so important, is that when you started to interpret, analyze a symbol, oftentimes, most of the time, it's a path that leads to the theme. And we're going to talk about themes later. That's going to be our last regular video in the series before we have another final epilogue video where we answer questions and bring up things that we.
Did you describe these as regular video? We are irregular. There's nothing about anything that we do is regular.
That's true. But anyway, one of the things I love is like how all these things tie together and support each other. So when you begin to think about symbols, you're really on the way towards understanding the themes of the story. Just like when you're beginning to analyze a character and you realize, oh, this character is dynamic, and here is where this character has this epiphany. Often that epiphany is right at the heart of the theme of the story. So symbols are a great way, to me, of accessing a point from which you can access or think about the theme of the story. That's something I really love.
And also, something to point out, Boromir acts symbolically, acts as a symbol within the Lord of the Rings as well. It's not just a thing. It's not just, an object is a symbol. Other things can be symbols, actions, characters, all of these things. And to think about Boromir in terms of symbolism, he is representative of humanity, of man, and of the fragility of this moral strength that we have, the good and evil within all of us, and how even someone for the right reasons for the right reason will justify and rationalize doing something bad, and that is a moral failure on his part there. But he had the right intentions, so we can start reading his actions and his character as having greater symbolic meaning beyond, oh, well, he was a bloke who, wanted to fight Sauron and thought the ring was useful. It goes beyond it. And that's where we start talking about those, when we talk about resonance and power and emotion being communicated, it's because we quite typically are thinking not just about the surface level action, but how that connects on a more abstract or conceptual level is representative of something greater than what is on the page, that it is connecting to bigger concepts. And when authors deploy this, quite often, we don't think about it consciously when we are reading.
Right.
But it's one of the reasons why so often we identify, and I hate using that word, but we identify with characters, even though they are nothing like us. We can understand their motivations. We can see ourselves in that situation. And it's not because any of us have been on a quest with a hobbit and a magic ring, or even anything like that. But we understand the temptation. We understand the temptation that Boromir faces. And that is where we sort of, not that we identify with, but we can understand, we can empathize, we can sympathize. And then we connect that to an aspect of our lives going, well, I might have been tempted once, but I was better than Boromir. I refused temptation. Whereas, of course, Philip, you succumbed to that temptation and became an evil Dark Lord.
Then you have characters like Gollum, who had that thing for so long. And Gollum, too, I think it can be taken as a symbol in the story, as a character who has become corrupt, but there's still within that character this kernel of the possibility of redemption, that there was a good person at one point in time, or at least part of that person was perhaps had the potential for goodness. that exists in that person. And then you see it come out in the later stages of the journey with Frodo and Sam, that Gollum has moments when he's so close to their genuine friendship, and there's a real desire for Smeagol to reclaim his humanity, or his hobbithood, or whatever it might be. And that's just such a beautifully realized aspect and underappreciated, I think, aspect of Lord of the Rings is that that Gollum's journey and how close he came to redemption, and how and for Tolkien particularly, Tolkien the devout Catholic, how Gollum's, as it turned out, he also, like Frodo in the end, succumbed to temptation. He wasn't trying to steal the ring out of altruism or to save the day, but he ended up accidentally saving the day with a kind of saving grace in the end, which for Tolkien had a kind of religious resonance there. So again, though, a very rich, this is a character here who feels like a character, but also functions on a symbolic level, I think. And that's just beautifully done. Did you want to say anything about that?
Well, and I wanted to build on that a wee bit because
Yeah.
one of the interesting things that we do not have to, but we can think about Gollum. It's this idea that someone could be saved, that they are not wholly evil, that there is a
Right.
potential that they could be saved. But also, as we see from his end, while that potential was there, it is not always realized because we are fallible, we are mortal, we are frail and flawed creations. And curiously, and this is one of the reasons why the orc problem is so interesting in Tolkien,
Mm,
because he never resolved that issue with the orcs.
right.
If if they were sentient and sapient and had complete free will, shouldn't they also be redeemable?
Mm,
But if they are entirely corrupt and can never be redeemed, then that sort of goes against his thesis of then they didn't have souls, they didn't have proper personhood in this sort of construction.
right.
And again, this is not to say Tolkien failed. These are questions that the work actually poses, which in a lot of respects, because it isn't resolved, leads the
Mm,
work to have greater resonance and longevity because it makes us wrestle with these really complicated questions of morality. Because we now start reading these characters as connected to a moral symbolism,
right.
and why characters on the side of good can be forgiven and can fix themselves and can be honored. But characters on the side of bad are not given that opportunity, and we can just celebrate them being destroyed. And again,
Yeah.
it goes to that dichotomy, it goes to that potential bias within ourselves. So I think it's a fascinating example. And again, it's not saying Tolkien, he was bad. This was something he struggled and wrestled with
Yeah.
over the what he had done with the creation of the orcs. And we can see it in his letters, we can see it in his notes, that
Mm-hmm.
the question of the orcs, the problem of the orcs, is something that he wrestled with and worked on and changed his mind about multiple times.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of these symbols, and let's stick with Lord of the Rings for a moment, I think, because it's a useful example. Um, but a lot of these symbols and these characters who function on a symbolic level, for example, Gandalf is the mentor figure in both The Hobbit and in Lord of the Rings. We recognize his function, we recognize the pattern behind his role in the story. And so a type of symbol, indeed, one that has become so pervasive as to be almost universal, is the archetype, which we have done a whole series on archetypes, which there's a playlist on my channel for we did like 17 or 18 videos on archetypes, I think it
I don't know,
was.
I can't count. We discovered that
We
when the
lost,
numbering got messed up.
got past 10, we both lost it. There is that one missing video out there in the void somewhere too, but
I hate you.
we skipped. I say we to include myself, but really it was AP. Skipped a one of the numbers in the series. Oh, did I just blame you for that? Oops.
Oh, look, there's a bus. I hope no one throws me under it. Hi, Philip. What are you? Ah!
But archetypes, yes, we were talking about archetypes. And these are essentially symbols that can be characters, it can be objects within the story that have achieved a certain level of universality because of their pervasiveness that we recognize. Ah, I know what that character Gandalf, I know him. Essentially, he fulfills the same function as Merlin or Dumbledore or Obi-Wan Kenobi or whoever. We recognize that pattern when we see it, and it has a kind of resonance within us because we already know what this character's purpose is. And sometimes authors can play with that and be a little subversive. Joe Abercrombie, for example, or Steven Erikson, for example, can play with that archetype and make it, surprise the reader, but often for a further purpose. So that's kind of fun as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and even talking about things that have more direct symbolism versus the more abstract stuff.
Right.
Aragorn's shattered sword, the shards of Narsil. You
Nice.
so you have Isildur is the righteous king, and then he falls. The line is partially broken. The goodness of man has been shattered,
Yeah.
represented in the shards of Narsil. Then, with the return of the king,
Yeah.
like dear Professor Tolkien, bit on the nose, but the sword is reforged, the line is
True.
reestablished, the
Yeah.
nobility is recreated, the
Yeah.
goodness of man is reestablished, and it ties into all of those uh, symbolic swords meaning kingship. So the Arthurian stuff, or the great warrior with his name sword. We see those connections. That's all part of the symbolic meaning. So there's something you can see like a very literal representation of something, and then it becomes more abstract.
And
Which
quite consciously, I think Tolkien was using that long tradition and giving his own story further resonance through that long tradition, because um, it can sometimes have this vastness to it as a result of being a shared tradition for so long that it just creates a kind of a scale and an energy that wouldn't be there otherwise, right? Because we all recognize the importance of this from all these other stories. So he's using that energy from all these other stories in that moment of reforging the sword and all of that, which it can work really well. So I think that's a really cool thing that some symbols are communal in that sense in stories that we all recognize them, we share them, and authors can use them and can use the resonance that they already come with. If they use it skillfully enough in their stories, they can make them enrich the story, or they can use them in a subversive way as well. So that's a really cool function, I think, of symbols, that
yeah,
especially the big ones that we all recognize.
but even looking at something like Romeo and Juliet,
Yeah.
two sides, two families feuding, the boy and the girl from these two families falling in love, but it you can see how they are representative of their families. The troubles that they have can be representative of the troubles that they experience. But also, then we can think about it. Well, what if it's not two families? What if it's two sides in a civil war? What if it's two countries?
Right.
And we can link that to what are the number of political marriages that were made to seal a peace treaty, to bring two sides together, to form alliances, that we
Yeah.
start seeing these things in more abstract conceptual levels. So Romeo and Juliet coming together could have, if it was playing out that trope, but them coming together could have forged this alliance and bridged the gap between these families. But it doesn't always work out that way. So Shakespeare, in that, knows that his audience understands, oh, here are the two people who are representative of their families, and they're going to form this alliance. And that's going to, projecting it as if this is going to be a comedy to come to that comedic end. And then Shakespeare subverts that because he knows his audience is expecting that. That's how you can subvert it. And it causes that depth. And then that has the whole resonance of sometimes these alliances fail. And that's when we start connecting it to other aspects that we know. But we wouldn't point at Romeo and Juliet and say, this is an allegory, or this means civil wars and blah, blah, blah. It's not that direct one-to-one. It's not as absolute. But we can see those range of possibilities in the understanding of the overarching narrative being read as a symbol, of actions within it being read as a symbol, of characters being read as symbols, as objects being read as symbols. That's why I think when we talk about the interpretation of literature, literature has a wealth of personal interpretation built into it. But just because there is this room for personal interpretation doesn't mean that every possible way of reading the text is going to be right or valid or cohesive or coherent or be supported by the text. And it can be difficult to judge where that line is. That's why we practice. It is a skill. It is something we develop. It's not 2 + 2 = 4. It is not a simple arithmetical function.
Right.
It involves judgment. It involves subjectivity, but also the ability to build a cohesive response.
Yep. Now, we were mentioning Tolkien's distaste for allegory and talking about symbols as as in modern literature, you tend to see symbols being used in a manner in which you can interpret them in multiple plausible ways. That is not to say that allegory does not have its place. Allegory does not equal bad here. We're not saying that. There are great allegories, particularly in older literature. I'm thinking of things like Piers Plowman or Paul Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, or even more recently, something like Animal Farm, I think by George Orwell, you could argue is an allegory. An allegory is simply where you have an abstract element that is being represented by a more what do I say? Concrete element. Let's put it that way. An abstract element that is being represented by a concrete element, and there tends to be a one-for-one association. So this woman named Charity in Pilgrim's Progress is the concept charity, and will only very consistently exhibit the qualities of charity, right? And there's a point being made here. And I think Animal Farm is a great example. If you've read Animal Farm, where you have certain characters that represent certain things in politics, and Orwell is making a point through those characters, right?
Yeah. And, we even think that one of the, do you remember the famous riddle of the Sphinx, Oedipus? And it was,
yes. Yeah.
4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, 3 legs in the evening.
Yeah.
And, what am I? And it's man. Starts off as a baby crawling on 4 legs, then walks upright on 2, and then in old age with a cane walking on 3.
Right.
So we can see it's a direct one-to-one. But if we think of like one of the really common symbols that gets deployed over and over again, the idea of a journey or a path or a river being used symbolically, that someone going along a river, and we see the changes over time. So Heart of Darkness springs to mind. Or A Worn Path, another classic American short story, where the physical path and the problems encountered along the way, again, we start reading them as representative of, symbolically connected to struggles within that person's life. We see these journeys of physical journey representing a temporal journey, representing a life. And journeys, rivers, all of these things, these are really common symbols and commonly deployed as symbols in that fashion. And so because there's almost like a dictionary of very commonly accepted or common usages of particular symbols, that's something that authors and writers of all sorts draw upon. because even if we are not absolutely aware of the specifics of that symbol, we have a general concept of it. We've seen it so many times, even if it's in the back of our head, that we pick up on it. And I wanted to point that out because sometimes it's not just about um like the things, the shape of the story itself. A travel log can be symbolic of our time.
Yes, yes. And there are so many different levels and different types of symbols that we could talk about. There are, just as everybody's heard of metaphors and similes, metaphor being a representation of something as if it were something else without using the word like or as, right? Whereas a simile is using like or as. So my love
Oh,
is a red, red rose, right? You mentioned a red rose earlier. My love is a red, she's not literally a red rose, but I'm trying to evoke all the things associated with the red, red rose. This is a kind of symbol that occurs within a sentence, right? Within a limited context of a sentence or a line if it's a poem, that sort of thing, right?
yeah, like Philip's heart is a cold, dead lump of rock. Um, oh no, wait, sorry, that's literal.
What would you
That,
be conveying with that line? I don't know.
I've just realized that's entirely literal. There's no symbolism attached. That's just a statement of fact. Um,
Hmm.
but synoc,
Synecdoche. Yeah,
the,
synecdoche, which is a type of metonymy. We should perhaps, do you want me to spell the word?
I know how to spell it. That we were talking about this earlier, and I said, you need to say these things. This when we read fantasy, sometimes people get really upset about the correct pronunciation or the incorrect pronunciation. What is the
Right.
correct? Synecdoche is a word.
Synecdoche. Yeah.
Synecdoche is a
Yep.
word I have seen written down, I have spelled, I have used multiple
Yep.
times. I never heard pronounced. And because of that, the default sound of that word in my head is not how
Right.
normal people say it. And so this is one of the reasons why I try very, very hard, because there are ones that bug me, but I try hard not to correct people's pronunciation, because usually if someone is mispronouncing a word, but it's the right word for them to be using and it's in the right context, they're using it correctly. The
Right.
reason they are typically mispronouncing it is because it is a symptom of having read it
Having
and
read it. Yeah.
understood it and it never being in conversation. So
Yeah.
why make people feel bad about
Yeah.
expanding their knowledge through reading?
Unless the person is your nemesis.
Yes. So yeah, there are certain literary terms that weirdly enough I have never heard in conversation. And yet,
Yeah, unless you're talking to a weirdo like me.
well, and or you've been giving a paper on it, and someone at the end comes up to you and goes, just so you know, that's not how that word's pronounced,
Yeah, yeah.
which is
But
terribly embarrassing. But at the same time, you go, well, that's how we learn.
yeah. So you were talking about metonymy and synecdoche being a type of metonymy, metonymy being using the name of one thing that is associated with the other thing that you're actually trying to talk about. So red tape being an example. When we talk about red tape, we're not literally talking about red tape, but red tape is associated with excessive bureaucracy, labeling things. And so it's just a phrase that everybody knows that is basically a stand-in for excessive bureaucracy. Now, synecdoche is when you have it's a type of metonymy where you have the part representing the whole. So when you're talking about you're talking about a ship, but you say the sail, or that's a nice set of wheels.
Yeah,
But you're
that's the
meaning the
one that I
whole
always go
car,
for because yeah,
right?
that's a great set of wheels. You go, yeah, they mean car, and
Right,
we're using a part of the thing to
right.
represent the whole of the
Right, right. So you
thing.
could, these are types of symbols that occur really on a very micro sort of sentence level. They don't tend to be something that, when we talk about symbols, it's important to mention like the ring in Lord of the Rings or the black box in the lottery. These are things that pervade the entire story that you're being asked to think about, that have resonance and repercussions that ripple throughout the entire story. So that's the difference, really. These things we're talking about now are kind of symbols, but on a very micro level, I guess you could say.
And it's a bit like Gimli saying, and my axe. His axe is representative of his complete support, not just that he's going to give them his axe.
Here's my axe. Good luck.
You have my bow. None of my arrows or me. You have the bow. They are representing a broader concept in that one thing.
Right.
How many bows did you bring? Does not mean did you get a cart full of bows. It's usually meaning how many archers did you bring that can engage in the fight. We use this all the time, and it's just sometimes again having the word or even knowing that the word exists, even if you can't pronounce it properly. Knowing that the word exists gives you that concept. With that concept, it allows us to be slightly sharper and more pointed and more aware of the things that we are seeing. And we don't make blanket statements like this symbol is this, because we're aware of the complexity of it. So instead of making blanket, absolute, direct statements like that, we temper it because we are aware of the flexibility and the ambiguity and the ranges that are implied.
Exactly. Another example, being watch out for fireballs, right? When you really mean be careful of the vast draconian Nemesis who will squash you if you're not careful, right?
Well, there was an old TV show called Bones. And in it, there's an FBI agent tied up who is partnered up with a forensic anthropologist, and they solve crimes. It's one of those, every week there's a crime and they solve it. But the FBI agent had a great line where he said, "Oh, the squints are coming," and they went, "What's a squint?" And it's like all of those scientist types who squint at evidence and try and pick up details. But so the term squint became this representation of all forensic people, all these people, and you go, "Oh yeah, and you all wear glasses," and there was so much tied into that one little image, that one little description, and it perfectly encapsulated so much. So yes, and it's also insulting, which told us a lot about his character, and the things that he valued, and that recognizing that these things, while we talk about them in distinct chunks, while we have these sort of bite-sized approaches where we isolate, like we've been talking about symbols, but so many times we've been going back into character and characterization or linking it to a narrative event, and it's because while we like to pick them out and speak about them in isolation, they are part of a greater whole, and therefore the connections between them, that's always in the back of our mind. We can take them out of the text, we can look at them, we can rotate them and look at them from different angles to get a better idea about it. But when we put it back in, we think about how that connects to setting and theme and character and narrative event and everything. Because, we carve out chunks to make it easier, more manageable, but we put them back and then use that to gain a greater understanding of the entire thing.
Well said. Well said. I agree. Yeah.
Anything else that you want to discuss in terms of symbols and symbolism?
No, I think we covered it pretty well. And it's fun to think about all the different levels of symbols that you can identify, even right down to the very words we're using right now. I mean, essentially every word is a symbol of a sort, right? We don't have to get quite so nitty gritty, but it's a fascinating subject, one that I really enjoy.
And we're not getting into semantics and semiotics. That is a very complicated conversation, which is often overly reductive and leads to a whole load of things. But we could end on "ce n'est pas un pipe." I might have mispronounced that.
What was it again?
The very famous picture of a pipe, and I can't remember. "Ce n'est pas un pipe."
Ce n'est pas un pipe. Yeah. This is not a pipe. Yes.
And technically, it's not. It's a painting. It's a representation of a pipe, but it is not in and of itself a pipe. Neither is the word pipe.
Right.
And so, we we can get into a whole conversation there, which is really complex and fun and interesting and engaging, but
Yeah.
we're trying to
Beyond
keep
the
it.
scope of this.
Well, Philip, thank you very much for joining.
Yeah.
I greatly appreciate that you invited me on to have these discussions with you about this. So thank you
Oh,
very much.
I'm having a blast, and thank you for hosting. You're hosting, right? I can't remember who's
Yeah.
recording this. You are, right?
Did I? Yeah, I pressed record. I just had to double check there.
Okay. That's good.
We are consummate professionals.
Yes, we know exactly what we're doing.
And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and we will see you in the next one.